you. Right? Yes? Thank you so much. And so also very glad that what I'm about to read was in many ways announced. The subject was announced by Don Bird, and I'm really going to talk about the particularized kind of abstraction that made Olson's utopian politics possible, or made us possibly thinking about that. And this particularized kind of abstraction is really quite abstract. It's called automorphism. So you bear with me, eventually we'll get there. But the title of my paper has changed. It's the politics of the inactual in Charles Olson's poetics. That Olson articulated his poetics as well as politics since the beginning of his intellectual journey in transnational terms is undeniable. He discounts the very idea of a nation throughout the maximum poems and makes his case by ways of his own and other voices. Thus, for instance, in the concluding lines of a fairly personal poem, December 18th, Olson indicts the idea of nationhood, citing Melville, and says, "We are not a narrow tribe of men, we are not a nation so much as a word." Olson thinks on a global scale. His attention extends across the globe geographically as well as culturally and temporally, stretching back into neoliberal times. The term transnational, however, is a relatively recent acquisition in critical discourse. It dates back to the mid-60s, but really it took up in the 80s and 90s. So instead of transnational, which is not what Olson used, he used two other terms, transcontinental and heterogeneous. The word transcontinental appears in his poems to Hart Crane, You, Hart Crane, and Bird's Obituary, both dated 1940, as well as in the second stanza of Two Propositions and Three Proofs, an early and singularly beautiful poetic manifesto dates back to 1945. In Two Propositions and Three Proofs, also repeats with a minor change a line from Bird's Obituary. Quote, transcontinental blood of Indian girl, beat of your dream, end quote. Also like the word heterogeneous, perhaps even more than transcontinental. Presenting Gloucester, the matrix of the Maximus poems, he writes, as the people of the earth now, Gloucester is heterogeneous, and so can no polis, not as localism. Reflecting on his heritage in 1948, he writes, I am of the heterogeneous present and not of the old homogeneity of the founders and the West. Nation states with their supposed, or in so many cases enforced, homogeneity of race, culture, ethnicity, and religion are abstract universals, and Olson was famously opposed to this. In his prayer to Athena, entitled The Big False Humanism Now On, Olson addresses the goddess, protector of polis across the globe, with the following words. Bona Dea, Athena, polis, the polity is necessarily as stretched. I hate universalization, believe it only feeds into a class of deteriorated personal lives anyway, giving them what they can buy, a cheap relief. Opposed to the false humanism of nations, false because it is based on sameness and homogeneity, is the polis as conceived by Olson. The polis is a fictional construct that does not belong to any recognizable historical past, although the heterogeneous city of Gloucester is offered as a possible but failed model for such polis. Polis is the utopian answer to the big false humanism of social control and the supporting metaphysical discourse of collective identity. Here we can begin to see that Olson's choice of the word heterogeneous is not only semantically pertinent, but politically ingenious, for heterogeneity summons the idea of a centrifugal motion opposed to the centripetal forces of homogenization active in any state or nation formation. Polis and its polity, as Olson remarks, is necessarily as stretched, but not in the sense of being flattened, becoming flat under the same professional political or religious belief. By marking the heterogeneity of Gloucester, Olson signals the possibility of creating an aggregation based on the upkeep of differences. And I must insist here on this word, possibility, because Olson realized that global capitalism breeds heterogeneity, and that this heterogeneity multiplies rather than transforms the falsity and the oppression of the national state, particularly the oppression of minority ethnic groups. Outside the boundaries of the nation, the realities of global economy, of global capitalism are harsh, to say the least. The existence, contemporary times, right, of Asian West shops or third world countries used as open fields for first world countries' chemical waste is, I think, sufficient evidence to underscore this point. Or we may want to think about the mass migration of enslaved African people as prime example of the kind of early oppressive and coerced globalization and kind of heterogeneity born under the sign of modern capitalism. The heterogeneity Olson finds in Gloucester partakes entirely of these historical realities, but the polis does not. Precisely because the polis is an imaginary construct and inactual reality. I believe this utopian perspective, and I'm going to argue this, is born out of a solid sense of realpolitik. I believe indeed that this, because I look at what's happening right now in contemporary scholarship of transnational studies, and it might be interesting to hear that many of the leading contemporary scholars find globalization and transnationalism a poisonous well, and they dispute our romantic attachment to notions of diasporas and massive migrations as salvific. As Aiwa Ong, a leading scholar in anthropology of globalization at Berkeley, concisely puts it, diasporas and contingent transnational ties are assumed to have normative goals of bringing about global solidarity, a kind of nascent transnational citizenship of cosmopolitanism with a big C. Scholars have looked to the mass migration spawned by global capitalism as the bearers of cosmopolitan ideals, expressing anti-state or anti-capitalist sentiments. Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, among others, have attributed humanistic liberatory dimensions to border crossings, especially by subaltern groups, but also middle-class migrants to Western metropolitan sites. The tendency has been to project onto actually existing cosmopolitanisms political features that subvert the agendas of global capitalism and subvert the struggle against oppressive practices of the national state. Now, Olson was eloquent about the danger of operating on such facile projections, on such romantic ideas. This was indeed the political imperative of his fight against the cheap beliefs. In other words, Olson was not an escapist. He did not take a last refuge in his utopian construction. He was a lucid, as I said before, political analyst who understood the realpolitik of the economic fabric that holds us together. And I take this liberty after Don said, of course, it's cultural, but it's a new politics. So, indeed, the clarity of Olson's analysis might appear prophetic only when we see these same questions. It were not even questions for Olson, it was just analysis. But we see the same questions re-emerging some 60 years later as novel thoughts. Thus, for instance, Bai Chi Dimok, a leading scholar in transnational studies, wonders whether quote, the transnational is always symmetrical to the national, a replay of its exclusionary form on a spatially extended register. And she answers in the positive, concluding that the opposition between the two terms, national and transnational, is spurious and empty distinction. The transnational turns out to be an extension and projection of the nation, not a challenge to it, but at best its functional subset. Now, it is then, again, a matter of symmetry, therefore, or the lack thereof. And again, my subject has been announced. The polis also envisioned is born out of a clear choice to seek a radical difference of discourse, a discourse that would asymmetrically counter the transnational. The polis is designed to remain inactual, so as not to become a subset of the nation, and so as to maintain its persuasive force. As Olson writes in the unpublished manuscript of Basel, the opposite of rational forms is not irrational, but a difference of discourse. And such difference of discourse is the guiding principle in all of Olson's work. The polis, however heterogeneous, is not a nation, for nations are prime examples of V-shaded rationality, and the polis is not an anarchic form of grouping or a grouping afflicted by the perverse stagnation of the Olson's base in contemporary living. for all these forms of grouping would count as irrational formations.